Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be continuing to look at the various patterns of development, sometimes known as rhetorical patterns. This information is adapted from Chapter 11, Patterns of Development, in my textbook, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. The last video lecture covered narration, description, exemplification, and compare-contrast. This video, Patterns Part 2, will cover the remaining 4 patterns, which are less intuitive. First, we will look at classification and division, which is separating, categorizing, or grouping ideas. Next, we'll examine definition, which examines how the meanings of words or phrases can be used to support arguments. Then, we will move on to process analysis, which involves examining the process by which something happens. Finally, the last pattern discussed in this video will be cause and effect, which is just discussing reasons and effects. As a reminder from the last video, something all the patterns have in common is that you want to focus on your purpose and be selective about how you use them. Without any further ado, let's begin with the first pattern, classification and division. Classification is an invaluable tool for understanding, and I use it constantly in this class. I have divided up the writing process, for example, into pre-writing, writing, and revision, and I divided pre-writing even further into brainstorming, organizing, and so on. This chapter itself is an excellent example. I've broken the ways of developing an argument into 8 categories, or classifications, called patterns, in order to help you better understand each one. Even though the classifications are somewhat artificial, as we've seen, they often overlap, for instance when description is being used in a narrative example, it helps you to understand them better, and thus to use them more effectively. The first point I'd like to make about classification is that there isn't a certain specific way that is the right way to classify a particular object or entity. There are myriad possibilities in anything. For example, while a library usually classifies books by genre, romance, sci-fi, biography, they could instead group the books by number of pages, by whether it has pictures, by the attention span needed, short, medium, or long, or by how popular it is, which is one of the classifications used by Amazon, or by the educational level needed to understand the vocabulary and references, each of which might be useful to different people in different situations. An excellent illustration of the infinite possibilities inherent in classification is the topic of animals. You could group them into wild animals, work animals, and pets, ones that swim, run, or crawl, or herbivores, hunters, and carrion eaters, as well as many other groupings. Each group of classifications has a principle of selection. There is a single aspect or element that determines how the animals are classified, by the degree of domesticity, by the method of movement, or by what they eat, in the examples I just gave. For instance, if I said tigers or dogs, you would easily and immediately be able to place the animal in the correct category simply by considering the principle of selection. It is essential to have this consistent principle of division to keep the classification consistent. What we call things, or where we draw the line between one class and another, depends on the interests we have and the purposes of the classification. For example, animals are classified in different ways by the meat industry, the fur industry, the leather industry, zoologists, biologists, and hunters. None of these classifications are more correct or final than the others. Each is useful for its own purpose. However, for the classifications to be useful, you must have that principle of selection. For example, here we go again, clarifying general or abstract ideas with exemplification. In a previous semester, one student chose to do the looking ahead question that asked you to classify types of friends and describe each. His categories were female friends, animal friends, social friends, and dependable friends. When taken individually, Each of these is indeed a type of friend, but as a group, these classifications fall flat. Given a particular individual, I might be hard-pressed to figure out which category he or she was supposed to fit into. If I had a female friend who was very social, but was also someone I could count on, which category should I put her in? It's impossible to place her because she belongs in more than one category at the same time. An even more illuminating example was written by the author Jorge Luis Borges, whose most famous work is The Garden of Forking Paths, and whose technique was the direct inspiration for Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. In one essay, he mentions, quote, "a certain Chinese encyclopedia entitled Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. On those remote pages it is written that animals are divided into A, those that belong to the emperor; B, embalmed ones; C, those that are trained; D, suckling pigs; E, mermaids; F, fabulous ones; G, stray dogs; H, those that are included in this classification; I, those that tremble as if they were mad; J, innumerable ones; K, those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush; L, others; M, those that have just broken a flower vase; and N, those that resemble flies from a distance." End quote. You can easily see that there are several problems with this list, mostly created by the lack of something in common they are being classified by, a principle of division. Again, you can't really use these categories effectively. Does a stray dog who broke a vase belong in category G or M? What about mermaids that belong to the emperor? Also, the number of categories makes this more difficult to remember, in addition to how arbitrary they are. As I pointed out when we were talking about schema in an earlier chapter, things that seem arbitrary are difficult to remember, as the example with the funny man with the ring that squirts water and the short man with the broom to turn on the light showed. Make sure to avoid these problems. A professor of cognitive psychology at UC Berkeley named Eleanor Rosch noted that the task of category systems is to provide the most amount of information with the least cognitive effort, and this example clearly fails miserably. However, this is not the only use that classification has, particularly in persuasive writing. As we've noted before, when you label something or put it in a particular category, there is an element of judgment as well. I once saw a Zitz cartoon where the mom is pulling her teenage son's clothes out of a laundry basket, sorting them into piles of dirty, disgusting, and horrifying. The son walks up and said, "I liked it better when you sorted my clothes according to color." Why did he like it the other way? Because the new categories are less neutral and more negatively judgmental. How a culture chooses to classify can also be revealing and informative. For example, ancient peoples grouped time differently than we do in the modern world. A year consisted of the seasons of planting, growing, harvest, and the cold season. What does that show about their culture? You can tell what they think is important by how they choose to divide the year. In this case, this is clearly an agricultural people whose lives revolve around growing food. What about us? We're tradition bound, even when we are unaware of that tradition. We divide time more finely than the ancients do, down to milliseconds, showing our obsession with tracking, timeliness, and productivity. We're based largely off Greek and Roman traditions. For instance, Janus, the ancient god of doorways, with two faces, one looking forward and one back, clearly has a connection with January. What about the fact that the Greeks and Romans named their months after gods? That shows how important and powerful they felt the gods were. They thought they avoided disaster by making the gods feel honored, and what is more honorable than having a month named after you? As another example, the Eskimo language has 40 different classifications, words, for snow because it is important for them to define it that finely. the type of snow makes an important difference. For us, just a few words or categories will do. The power of classification is also evidenced by the number of sayings that start out, "There are two types of people in the world." If a person says that there are two types of people, those who talk and those who listen, as I saw on a bumper sticker once, it's immediately clear which type of person is supposed to be the better one. Volkswagen, with its motto that the world is divided into drivers and passengers, is clearly trying to sway you towards one of those roles and into devaluing or deriding the others. How you define or label the groups makes a difference too, as you can see in the contrast between saying that the world is made up of neat freaks and normal people versus saying it's made up of slobs and normal people. When we name something or label it, we are classifying. When one person kills another, is it an act of murder, an act of temporary insanity, an accident, or an act of heroism? As soon as the process of classification is completed, our attitudes and conduct are, to a considerable degree, determined. We punish the murderer, treat the insane, absolve the victim of circumstances, and pin a medal on the hero. As mentioned in your textbook, many debates are ultimately problems of classification, like the abortion controversy, where foes classify the unborn entity as a baby and therefore define abortion as murder, whereas advocates call that same unborn entity a fetus and part of the mother's body, giving her the right to make decisions about it. Classification determines our attitudes and behavior towards the object or the event in question. Classification has several uses, some of which we've already been discussing. Classification can be used to group and organize information, which leads to easier learning and memory. Classifying helps clarify the differences and similarities in the things being classified, and it can create a fresh new way of viewing something. Finally, it can help explain things that aren't well understood by grouping them together with similar things, or breaking them down into their parts, as I'm doing with providing support in this chapter by breaking it into 8 categories. An example that shows the power of classification is the case of Jeff Silverman, who worked in local children's shoe stores during high school and college, and he noticed there were 4 kinds of parents buying shoes for their toddlers. There were traditionalists who wanted unchanging shoes from reliable, established companies, well-known brands with a reputation for quality, even if the styles didn't change and they were a bit more expensive. There were economy-oriented parents for whom price was the most important factor. They see all shoes as basically the same, so how they classify affects their actions. There were also fashion-conscious parents who wanted their kids' shoes to be mini versions of their own. Finally, the last type of parent he ran into he called attentive parents. These parents didn't just want a good fit, but also design and materials that were really right for baby play and learning to walk. These well-informed, upscale shoppers were willing to pay a premium price if they found the right product. After he had identified these classification of parents, Silverman realized that there were companies with shoes aimed at all of the groups, except the attentive parents. So he made a business plan, got investors, and at 24 years old, he created a company that he named Toddler University. They started making high-quality shoes for little kids with more comfy rubber soles, longer lasting because they were stitched rather than glued, and with a big opening to get them on easily, and were measured by foot's length, width, and girth rather than just length alone. And they sold for a higher price of around $35 to $40 a pair. In 4 years, Silverman went from $100,000 in sales to $40 million in sales. Then he sold the company for a huge profit to one of the biggest firms in the footwear business, all because his classifications showed him an untapped market. Nor is classification the only act that increases understanding. While division is often used as an aid to classification, it can also be a useful tool by itself. Using division can help people understand a whole. For instance, in order to understand why a wedding cake might cost $5,000, you might divide it into pieces. When you realize that some divisions for that $5,000 cake include 192 eggs, 38 pounds of sugar, and 3 people working for 135 hours, you understand better why it costs so much. I do this too. I'm teaching about writing, and I divide it into concepts like invention, revision, and paragraphing. I also divide within subjects, like when I divided invention into different strategies, like research and brainstorming, and then further into types of brainstorming. As another example, I saw an internet meme with a picture of a scorpion with its tail raised to strike. It said, "Scorpions, nature's way of saying, screw you, I'm going to combine lobsters, spiders, wasps, and nightmares." This division of a scorpion's parts makes a clear, dominant impression, and also illustrates that the breakdown doesn't have to be literal, since obviously nightmares are not an animal. So, what should you do when classifying? First, you should examine the subject from several angles, figuring out a few different ways it could be subdivided or grouped, paying special attention to similarities and differences. Then, you sort the objects into relevant categories according to shared characteristics. Pick your categories with care, making sure that everything conforms to your principle of selection. Use mutually exclusive categories so there won't be confusion when trying to decide which category something goes in. You should explain each category or component and, as always, consider your audience and purpose. Examples are often an essential part of classification, usually being used as illustrations. Closely related to classification is the idea of definition, explaining what something is and isn't. How you define something says something about what you think about it, and more, it can influence people unconsciously. English have a lot of words that mean basically the same thing according to the dictionary, but carry very different connotations, which are the emotional or judgmental aspects or associations. Which one you pick is the difference between defining the neighbor's kids as wild, undisciplined hooligans or defining them as rowdy, rambunctious little boys. Often, this word choice has more impact on us than we realize, as we soak up the interpretation along with the label or definition. You do have to be careful with definition, however, as there is almost nothing more uselessly boring as when a writer starts an essay with a dictionary definition of a commonly understood word. However, that isn't to say that definition has no utility in writing. Used correctly, definition can be a powerful tool. We discussed the types of meaning before. The difference between someone who is refined and someone who is snobby can be more a matter of perception than any actual difference. Man's best friend versus a mutt versus a hound all have different connotations, even though they are all words for dogs. Definition has several different uses. Of course, the most obvious is that you can use definition to clarify. If you are using a vague conceptual word like justice or freedom, a definition can clarify what you mean, which part of the complex and multifaceted meaning that you're referring to. For example, ancient Greeks considered freedom very differently than we do. They considered freedom to be the opposite of slavery. Therefore, if you were not a slave, you had freedom, regardless of what tyrannical laws your government might enforce, or whether your father chose to have you beaten to death for embarrassing your family. On the other hand, we think of freedom as having two parts, and notice how division here is being used to define and clarify, another indication of the overlap between the patterns. The freedom to do things, speak, assemble, bear arms, etc., and the freedom from things, unjust imprisonment, religious persecution, etc. Which definition of freedom you're using makes a big difference. Debates over what constitutes torture were in full force after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when George W. Bush approved harsh interrogation techniques that were banned by President Obama when he took office. Bush's officials issued a memo that argued that what they called enhanced interrogations constitute torture only if they intentionally caused suffering equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. The tactics approved included prolonged sleep deprivation, shackling into painful stress positions for long periods while naked and in a cold room, being slammed into a wall, being locked inside a small box, and the suffocation tactic called waterboarding. Anyone who has ever had a newborn baby can attest to the torture that is sleep deprivation, and being cuffed into a horribly painful, twisted position in a freezing room while naked seems indistinguishable from torture by many people. But in this case, definitions made a huge difference. You can also use definition to change a reader's understanding of a word. You might write an essay arguing for or against the idea that family should only include blood relatives and those through marriage, for example. You can use definition to argue against the change in a word as well, as author Nicholas Thompson does in an essay called Hero Inflation, about how the word hero has become so overused that it is losing its meaning. The author says that ancient Greek heroes were larger than life. They performed great deeds. He says heroes should be people who transform the world, are incredibly brave or self-sacrificing, and are noble of heart. Plus, they have to succeed. He argues against the idea that the victims of the 9/11 attack are heroes, or that someone a child admires is a hero, and says it devalues the true meaning of heroism. You can also use definition as a way to come to a greater understanding of a term as well. Perhaps you merely want your readers to re-examine a term and consider its importance. Education is a word familiar to all, and you've had years of experience with it. But that's not the whole story. Were you to write about the word within the context of your college education, you might begin by chasing down its etymology, which would bring you to the Latin educatus, meaning brought up. From there, you might speculate on how the meaning of education has shifted from conveying general knowledge and developing reason and judgment to emphasizing skills and preparation for a profession. At that point, you would have the makings of an argument for or against that change. As another example, consider the term senior citizen. What does senior mean? One definition is more important, experienced, superior, higher rank, especially due to experience, such as the phrase a senior officer. What about citizen? A citizen is someone with rights and responsibilities, paying taxes, voting, following the laws. Just with these quick definitions, you can see a shift in how we might think of senior citizens. Not just old people, but experienced people who deserve respect and have both rights and responsibilities, just like the rest of us. Definition, perhaps more than any other rhetorical pattern, uses other modes to serve its purpose. Were you to write an essay on honesty, for example, you might begin your discussion with a narrative, a brief story about a friend who bought a magazine at a newsstand and received too much change for a $20 bill. The narrative can then lead to comparison and contrast, making the distinction between honesty and dishonesty. And if the friend kept the money but felt guilty about it, then you would be dealing with cause and effect. Make your reader feel that guilt, and you'll be using description. A definition of grace could cite the example of Michael Jordan's drive to a basket, or a cheetah running in the wild. If you were writing a short research paper defining the common cold, comparison could help you distinguish it from the flu, and process analysis would help you analyze its progress from first sore throat to last sniffle. In between, You might discuss possible ways to relieve symptoms, which would bring in classification. Although you may use many different modes, your primary one would still be definition. Here is one example of the way how we define something can carry value judgment. This meme defines laziness as simply an insulting word for efficiency. Now that we've discussed definition, let's move on to the next pattern. Process analysis is simply breaking a process or action down into its parts. You analyze or describe the process. There are essentially two types of process analyses, depending on the purpose. The first type is a directional process analysis. You can think of this as a set of directions for the person to follow. A directional process analysis is used when you expect the person to actually carry out the process. Examples of directional process analyses are things like instruction manuals, cookbooks, or the explanations in my textbook of processes like revision. However, this type is less common in an expository essay. The type of process analysis that you usually get in an essay is an explanatory process analysis, where you explain how a process works or what happened without expecting that the person is going to do the process themselves. For instance, explanations in history class about how World War II started, or an explanation of how photosynthesis works in science class. This type is often used in essays. For example, if you're arguing that chocolate is good for you, contrary to what people think, you could explain the process of how it is digested to show the benefits it has. If you're arguing for laws requiring more humane treatment of animals, you could explain the process of raising a particular animal for slaughter, being ripped away from the mom, being held in a place too small for it, often splattered with waste, being fed sludge, before being subjected to an automated death process that doesn't always kill the animal, leaving some buried alive in the corpses of their neighbors. This explanation of the process could be a compelling argument, especially if you use description well. For either type, the format is almost always a series of steps in order. Some of the things that you'll want to do in writing a process analysis is to separate the process into the necessary steps or parts, describing each in detail. You'll want them in a logical order so that they're easy to follow, with clear transitions to warn a reader when you're moving from one step to the next. One of the most important tips is to consider the trouble spots. What parts are readers most likely to have trouble understanding or performing? Back in Chapter 3, I had a directional process analysis which explained how to write a pie paragraph. If you look back at it, you can see that I used these tips. How to write a paragraph was divided into 3 steps: writing the point, writing the information, and writing the explanation. And they were organized in a way that made sense, in this case, from the beginning of the paragraph to the end. And it is obvious which of the 3 elements I am talking about at any given time. You can see that I spent much more time on the E, or explanation portion, than I did on the other 2. I had an entire section called Making Sure You Have Enough E in Your Pie, even though the other 2 sections of point and information didn't have anything similar. I actually spent more time on that section than the other 2 combined. This was because I knew that the explanation would be the trouble spot, since it is both the most difficult and the most unfamiliar to most students. Finally, you want to make sure that your thesis or topic sentence not only mentions the process you're going to be analyzing, but makes some sort of point or argument. Don't forget that you're writing an expository essay, and stay focused on the argument. When you're writing a process analysis, one of the most important things to do is to prepare. Study the process, brainstorm or research the steps, and make sure you understand both the steps or parts as well as how they fit together or what the sequence is. In addition, you want to be sure to consider what your audience does and doesn't know. You don't want to bore them with details about something they already know, but you want to make sure that unfamiliar parts are made clear. Again, consider my pie process analysis from the paragraphing chapter as an example of tailoring an explanation to your audience. While process analysis can sound somewhat confusing, it's really very simple, an explanation of a process. This doesn't sound very interesting or useful in an essay, but it really can be. For example, if you're trying to prove that cheerleading is a sport that deserves more respect than it gets, you might explain the process of training and practicing, and how much time, dedication, and athletic skill it takes. Cause and effect analysis is the method of dividing occurrences or events into their elements to find relationships among them. Cause and effect is commonly used, but can be more complex than it might seem at first glance. For example, nearly anything in life is both an effect of things and a cause of other things, creating a cause and effect chain of linked phenomena where one cause creates an effect that causes something else. There are several aspects to identifying cause and effect relationships that can make them a bit more challenging and complex than they might seem on the surface. One is that in real life there are usually multiple causes for any effect and multiple effects for every cause, although they are all usually not of equal importance. For example, you're taking this English class at Santa Rosa Junior College, which is an effect of needing the class for a degree and a cause of better understanding of reading and writing concepts. There are multiple reasons that you're here, ranging from your primary reason, you need the class to graduate or transfer, to secondary reasons. This class fits into your schedule, the reasons you chose to do it this semester instead of another, you heard the teacher was awesome, and so on. Cause and effect are not inherent, they're relational. So whether something is a cause or an effect depends on where you are looking from. Your dog vomiting is the effect of eating grass, but a cause of him being kicked out of the house. So whether it's a cause or an effect depends on your perspective. Again, in real life, a single cause generates many effects, and one effect is the result of multiple causes, making things complex. For instance, smoking can cause heart disease, lung cancer, and emphysema, or heart disease may be caused by smoking, obesity, and genetics. In addition, smoking can be a contributing factor in an individual with all three diseases, or an individual with heart disease may smoke, be obese, and have a family history. Cause and effect can be messy, complex, and hard to untangle. Causes and effects often occur in a sequence known as a causal change, one where cause creates an effect that then becomes the cause for another effect, and so on. You can see this in the children's book If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, where the protagonist gives a mouse a cookie, which causes the mouse to get thirsty and need milk, which causes him to get a milk mustache, which causes him to look in the mirror to get it off, which causes him to realize he needs a haircut, and so on and so forth. The entire book is one big cause and effect chain. As another example, smoking can cause emphysema, which causes a person to slow down, which leads to weight gain, which can result in heart disease. Since there are so many moving parts, it can be useful to evaluate the various causes and effects. As I already mentioned, there are primary causes and effects, as well as secondary ones of less importance. There are also immediate and remote causes and effects, and it's useful for sorting out events in time so that you can identify the various links and whether they're primary or secondary, immediate or remote. Immediate causes or effects happen nearest an event, while remote ones happen farther away in time. Primary causes are directly and primarily responsible for the outcome, such as needing this class for a degree as a cause for taking it, whereas secondary causes merely contribute to the outcome, such as this section having seats and not interfering with any of your other commitments. Related events sometimes overlap, sometimes follow one another immediately, and sometimes connect over gaps in time. They vary in their duration, complexity, and importance. Analyzing causes and effects thus requires not only identifying them, but also discerning their relationships accurately and weighing their significance fairly. It's all too easy to make a mistake in identifying the relationships. One of the most common is mistaking time order for cause and effect. There's a logical fallacy usually presented in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc, meaning after this, therefore because of this. The fact that it's a fallacy is a pretty strong clue that it is not going to stand up to scrutiny. In the textbook, I give the example that just because you ate a cupcake before getting an A on a test doesn't mean that the cupcake caused the A. It probably has more to do with the amount of studying, your attendance at class, and so on. However, this type of error isn't always as obviously ridiculous. Just because a big box store moves into town and then later a smaller store closes its doors doesn't automatically make them connected. It may be that the owners of the smaller store were elderly and were planning to close down at that time anyway. Don't assume. As another example, there's an old joke that goes something like this. A guy walks into a bar, sits down, and orders a beer. As he waits for his beer, he claps his hands together again and again, loudly and insistently. Annoyed, the bartender asks, "Hey, pal, what's up with the hand clapping?" And the guy says, "It scares the elephants away." "But," says the bartender, "there aren't any elephants around here." And the guy replies, "See, it's working." Just because clapping happened first and a lack of elephants happened after doesn't mean they're cause and effect. Also, keep in mind not to fall into the trap of oversimplifying when considering causes. It's nearly cliché to say that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves of the American South, but it's also far from the whole truth. There were monumental economic and political causes behind that war. Without those other causes, there might not have been a war at all. One of the biggest issues wasn't the issue of slavery per se, but rather the issue of how much control the central government should have over the states. The South wanted to become its own country. The North didn't want to lose control over it. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's a logical fallacy to assume that because things happen together, one is the cause of the other. Correlation is not causation. For example, sometimes people talk about the increasing violence in music, television, and other forms of entertainment as being a cause of increasing violence in real life, such as the school shootings. However, it's more likely that the increase of violence in both entertainment and real life are effects of changes in society, the economy, or other root causes. Both are effects rather than being a direct cause and effect. Cause and effect have many uses. They can be used to predict events, to determine consequences, to assign responsibility, and even to make plans. Remember, the patterns of development have three main uses. They are great for brainstorming support material, particularly if you use the questions for brainstorming that I included with each. They can help you come up with more material to make papers longer and stronger at the same time. And awareness of the patterns can help you analyze the writing of others. Also, there are certain themes that come up with all of the patterns, such as keeping your purpose in mind, being selective and concise, and considering your audience, for example. I hope that the discussions and information contained in this video and the textbook chapter were useful and helpful, and that you now have a better idea about how you can use the various patterns of development to develop your writing and to evaluate the writing of others. Thank you for joining me in this discussion of the 8 main patterns of development. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any question you may have about the material. I'm always happy to help. And as always, There's more information in the description box below.